Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do another round of recent reads focusing on horror books that I received from publishers or from indie authors. This is probably the last round of review copies that I'm going to do before the end of the year. And don't worry, you're still going to get more review videos from me, but it's going to be focusing on backlist titles, things that I'm reading from the library or audiobooks and all of that. But I wanted to get to these books before the end of the year. There are some really good ones to talk about, and let's get started. First, let's talk about The Messy Man by Chris Sorensen, the third book in the Messy Man series. This is one that I received from the author for review, and you probably already know a little bit about the series because The Nightmare Room, the first book, was one of my all-time favorites. I talked about it in my recent video about my top 10 horror books of all time. And so, of course, I was very excited to get this book and get a chance to find out how the trilogy ends. Now, while this is the third book, I'm going to keep this review totally spoiler free, even for those of you that have not started the series, so don't worry, you don't have to click off. Basically, in the first book, we follow a couple that move into a house that is possibly haunted by a person named the Messy Man, and then the story goes from there. Each one has a different focus in the series, so this third book actually follows a young girl that has paranormal powers and can possibly connect with the dead, particularly her dead father, and then there's also a man who shows up in an old abandoned church. Now, the first two books in the series more are focused on haunted buildings, the first one being a haunted house, the second is a haunted motel. And while this one focuses on a decrepit church, I will describe this one as more supernatural horror, and it definitely is more focused on the Messy Man himself, as the title would suggest. And I will say that it was a good ending to this series. It definitely wrapped things up, and without giving away too much, I thought I did a really good job of bringing it all back to the beginning and just tying everything together, which is what I want to see in a trilogy. This is a case that while each book has a different focus, I would actually say you really need to go back and read the first two books, The Nightmare Room and The Hungry Ones, before reading this one, because it is going to spoil a lot. And while you can read this one, it honestly won't fully make sense without that background, because there's a lot of setup, and there were characters that were in this book that were introduced earlier on, and you just need that to get the full picture. If you have already read those books but you need a refresher, I really like that the author actually took the time and wrote little synopsis at the end of the book, so it just kind of reminds you of the past events. I was doing a reread through this series before this book came out, but I never actually got to reread The Hungry Ones, so I really appreciated that. Overall, it was really well written. I think that Chris Sorensen does a really good job of writing emotional family stories, and that's really the strength, is that he writes about families and very imperfect families, and I love that. In this book, you get to see the relationship between this young girl with paranormal powers and her mother is a very difficult woman, and I really like that Chris Sorensen just paints these really intricate relationships and doesn't shy away from the grittier side of life, the fact that things are not perfect, and I really love that. So I'd say if you're already a fan of the series, you'll be very satisfied with where this ends. If you haven't started it, start back at the beginning. And personally, my favorite is still The Nightmare Room, but definitely a solid book, and I would recommend the whole trilogy. All three books are definitely worth reading. Next, let's talk about Children of the Red Peak by Craig DiLouie. This is one that I received from the author's publicist, and this story follows a group of young people that when they were children, their families were involved in a religious cult, and something terrible happened. There was a massacre and everyone but them died. However, when they went to authorities to try to get help and went back to the place where this massacre occurred, all the bodies of those other people in the cult had disappeared, and now the story begins years later when they are reuniting as adults. One of them has just died, and so they're all coming back to the funeral. This is a story that is told over two timelines, one being the present day when again the children are coming back together as adults, and then the other timeline takes place when they were children, and you really get to see their experience in a religious cult. Now, for most of this book, I would say that it read more like general fiction than horror, with the main focus being on that religious cult angle. If you were someone that is fascinated by those cultures, those cults where people just get roped into it and the social pressures and all of that involved, you will definitely like this one. Now, personally, while I do find cult fiction fascinating to a point, it's not one of my favorite subgenres to delve into. And so I really do think that your reading enjoyment of this one will highly depend on how much you are interested in those topics. And I'd say that both timelines were evenly made up, so I was equally interested in the past and present. For me, the biggest draw was the disappearance of the people and what really happened at that event when everyone was massacred. And I think that the creativity in this book was really good in terms of setting up a horror book surrounding cults in a way I haven't seen before. But again, for the most part, most of this book really read as a general fiction story about cult life, and it's just not a topic that I can read for hours and hours at end, so it didn't completely hold my attention. The characters were fine, but not overly well developed for my personal taste. But it was an interesting one. I did not like the ending, and that's probably the biggest kicker. If you can see that I'm a bit more hesitant in this review. It's going to be a controversial ending. Some people will like it. I did not like where it went, and so it definitely left me a little bit disappointed. Still very grateful to get a chance to read this one. Again, it's one that I think other people will enjoy more than me, just based off of reading taste, but an interesting one for sure, with again a creative twist on the horror cult subgenre. Next up, we have Night Terrors by Tim Waggoner, and this is one that I received from the publisher Angry Robot Books. It's actually a republication of a book that came out a few years back, and they came out with this beautiful new edition, and I gotta say the cover is gorgeous. But of course, we're here to talk about what's in the book, and this is actually a dark fantasy that follows a detective that has a sidekick who is a clown. This clown is basically the clown of their childhood nightmares that has come to life and is helping them to protect the world by tracking down the murders and mysteries surrounding the dream world that is trying to break into the real world. And so I want to preface that this really is dark fantasy. It's actually not horror, but given the subject matter and the fact that this book is all about a creepy clown, I did feel comfortable to include it in this video because I think that most people that enjoy clown fiction are really going to enjoy this one, even though it's really not scary, and I don't think it's written to be scary. Instead, it's much more fantastical. But if you are someone who is scared of clowns, there is a fantastic character in here that you will love. His name is Jinx. He is that sidekick clown, and he puts on a full face of makeup, all of the clown gear, and he is just the most amazing personality. For me, he sells this book. He is snarky and sarcastic and funny and goofy and all of the things that I would look for. I think especially if you like the Pennywise persona of a clown that was so popularized in It, this is the kind of clown you're gonna get. So I had a lot of fun reading this book. In terms of the actual mystery elements, the detective story, it was a little bit average. It's not the kind of book where you're going into it for the mystery. You're really going into it, I think, for the aesthetics and for the setup. And I had a lot of fun with it. Dark fantasy, specifically urban fantasy, is not normally my forte, but considering that it's not normally my subgenre, I definitely had fun with this book. It was entertaining, it was light. I believe it's the start of a series, so I definitely would be open to reading further books because yeah, this was a lot of fun. Moving on, we have a novella called The Visitor by Sergio Gómez. This is a horror novella set around Christmas during a blizzard and follows a group of people that are in a diner when a mysterious, possibly otherworldly visitor shows up. I was very excited to read this one because of course the author is one of my new favorites. He of course wrote Camp Slaughter, one of my favorite and scariest reads. And if you don't know, if you somehow do not know, I'm a huge fan of horror books that are set around Christmas. And so I was very excited to receive a review copy from the author. And I'll say that this book was a lot of fun. It definitely had those Christmassy elements, but they weren't overdone to the point that it was obnoxious or kind of got in the way of the story. In fact, I actually think you could very easily read this book after Christmas without it seeming weird. But this book is coming out in December, so it isn't out as you're watching this video if my filming schedule is on track. But I'll say that if you also enjoy Christmas horror, it is a good one to check out. It's very short, again, given the length as a novella, and I did perhaps want a little bit more from it. But again, if you're just looking for another horror story to read that just happens to have those Christmas elements, I think you'll be pretty satisfied with it. While it does have that otherworldly feel to it, this book is definitely horror and not sci-fi. Again, overall it was fun, but I did want a teeny bit more from it. It just was lacking a little bit of the oomph that I'm used to expecting from this author, which is almost a compliment because I think I set my expectations pretty high when it comes to Sergio Gómez's books. Finally, I read We're Watching by Michael David Wilson and Bob Pastorella. And this is another horror novella, but this one follows a man that moves into a building and he discovers that there is a hole in the wall that allows him to creep on his neighbor. His neighbor is this beautiful woman that dances to the same song every night, and he is transfixed by her and basically becomes that creepy man watching over her. Eventually they do get the chance to meet, and soon enough he realizes that there is more going on, and while he is watching her, there may be other people watching him. I really enjoyed this premise. I thought it was a lot of fun. I love the idea of any kind of stalker, creeper situation. Those are just buzzwords that I really enjoy, not just in horror, but also in thrillers. So this book definitely had a lot of appeal for me. I'll say that the ending left me a little bit wanting more, but in terms of an enjoyable read, this one was fun and fast, and again, kind of a little bit sexy, and yeah, it was just a fun read for sure. So that is it for this round of recent horror reads focusing on books that I received for review. I would love to hear all your opinions down below on these books, and also let me know what was your favorite book that you read in 2020. The year is quickly wrapping up and I'm compiling my best of the year list, so I want to make sure that I'm reading all the best horror books so that I can give you my top 10 horror and thriller books for the year. So I'm going to be wrapping that all up really soon. If you are new to my channel, consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror, thrillers, science fiction, and fantasy. And if you're already subscribed, thank you so much. Please give this video a thumbs up, hit the notification bell if you haven't already, and share this video around online, on Twitter, Reddit, and anywhere else that you live. Thank you so much. I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.